Questions and answers. Since time began, there have been three questions that people have always asked and tried to answer, and will probably keep on asking forever. Number one, what is this world we live in, and how was it created? Number two, how can we live in it with other people and be happy? Number three, what will happen to us when we die? Back in the earliest days of history, when these questions first puzzled the ancient Greeks, they used their imagination and invented myths to explain what they did not understand. For hundreds of years, these myths about Father Heaven, Mother Earth, the Titans, and the great gods of Olympus seemed to satisfy the people. But long before the common people lost faith in them, these primitive ideas failed to satisfy the thinkers. Beginning almost 600 years before this age of Augustus, there had been a golden age in Greece, when Athens became so full of these great thinkers as to be a veritable thinking shop. All were trying to discover the true answer, or at least one, if not all, of the puzzling questions. But as they searched for the truth, this idea of it varied, just as pure sunlight appears to be red, green, blue, or violet when seen through different colored windows. To the first question, for example, one thinker answered that water had been the substance from which the world was made. Another said fire, another air, another said a mingling of water, fire, and air and earth. One believed the universe was all mind. Another said no, that it was all matter, built up from its smallest particle, which he called an atom. All the answers and ideas which have since been divided into different sciences were taken together and called philosophy. Pythagoras was one of the earliest of the Greek philosophers and the first one to teach that the world was round. Interested in mathematics, he felt sure that numbers were the key to everything. All things in heaven and on earth depended on the rhythm, music, and harmony of numbers. Pythagoras had been born on the island of Samos about 586 BC, or about 150 years after Rome was founded. As a young man, he traveled and talked with priests and wise men everywhere around the Mediterranean, especially in Egypt, the main center of learning. There he studied astronomy and became convinced that the earth was a globe or a sphere. Later, his followers taught that Earth revolved with the other planets around a central fire or hearth of the universe. The planets, he knew, traveled at different rates of speed, and he believed that as they went, the slower ones, like Jupiter and Saturn, gave off deep low tones, and the swifter ones, like Mercury, clear high tones which blended together into beautiful music. The harmony of the spheres. The reason we don't hear it is because the music never ceases, and we can't compare it to silence. And so, since the rate of speed and the notes of music could be expressed in numbers, he said the numbers were everything. Pythagoras himself, it is said, liked to set down numbers in various patterns and shapes and study them. How do you count? He once asked a pupil. 1, 2, 3, 4, the pupil began. Stop, said Pythagoras. I will show you how 1, 2, 3, and 4 make 10. Taking his crayon, he arranged dots in this way. This, he said, is the holy triangle of 4. Working with triangles one day, he discovered one of the first laws we learn to use in geometry. He drew a triangle like this. Then he drew 3 squares, one on each side of the triangle. These he marked off into small equal squares and counted them, discovered that the squares on the largest or the longest side was equal to the sum of squares of the other two sides. That is called the law of the 3 squares, or theorem or Pythagoras. More than 100 years passed, and then, when the Golden Age was at its height, there might have been seen in the marketplace of Athens a short, ugly, thick-set little man with a bald head, a flat nose, and wearing an old wrinkled tunic. Surrounded by the finest young men of Athens, he would walk among them, talking to them and training them to think for themselves by asking them questions. What is goodness? He would ask them. What is happiness? When and why are you truly happy? When are you miserable? Know yourself, he would say, for Socrates was most interested in finding out about the hearts and minds of people and how they might lead a good and happy lives. Then he was inspecting how the world was made. It seemed to him a more useful kind of wisdom. As for the third question, puzzling the Greeks, he believed the soul was immortal. But, he said, there is only one way to prepare for immortality, and that is to love this life and live it as bravely and as cheerfully as we can. His teaching was as simple and beautiful as his body was ugly. Life and its possessions are not of great importance, he told his pupils, but a good life is, for no real evil can come to a good man either in life or death. And so he urged them not to strive for possessions, but for wisdom. For goodness, he said, comes with wisdom. Truth is the great possession, for truth and goodness are one. Truth, the spirit of truth, that was the God of Socrates, the one God to whom he urged the young men of Athens to be faithful. And so he was condemned, because he would not lead them back to the old gods of Olympus, whose evil conduct was worse than that of most human beings. The ruling citizens of Athens accused Socrates of leading their young sons astray. No doubt they called him an atheist, a word that people today are often used to condemn someone whose idea of God does not agree with theirs. Socrates was arrested, jailed, and condemned to die by drinking a cup of poisoned hemlock. But Socrates bore no ill will toward those who had condemned him, nor did he have any fear of death. Be of good cheer, he said to the sorrowing pupils who were with him at the end. You are bearing only my body. Such was the end of the wisest, the justest, and the best of all men whom I have ever known, said Plato. Plato was 26 when his old teacher Socrates died. He was the greatest of all his teacher's pupils, and many believed the greatest of all philosophers. Plato was a handsome youth, tall and strong. He had an outstanding record both as soldier and as athlete. It was because his soldiers were so very broad that he was called Plato. Plato means broad, like the word plateau, and like a plateau which is both high and broad, was the philosophy of Plato. He was excited by almost every question concerning God or man, and he made his answers so dramatic and colorful that they became great literature. For unlike Socrates, Plato put his ideas into writing. His Republic is one of the greatest books. In it, Plato imagines an ideal state, one that would so train its citizens to lead good and useful lives that each one would be happy. It was an idea, but to Plato, ideas were everything ideas only had real life. A tree is chopped down and burned, flowers fade and fall, and a man dies. But there will always be men and trees and flowers. The idea lives on. Once the world itself was only an idea in the mind of God, just as a vase was put an idea in the mind of the sculptor before he modeled it in the clay, just as a poem was but an idea in the mind of poet before it was expressed in words. Plato had a most brilliant young pupil named Aristotle, one who had a most orderly mind, cold and calm and keen. Although he was Plato's pupil, he disagreed with his teacher. Facts were more real and important to Aristotle than ideas. Actual facts about animals, minerals, vegetables, facts that he could observe and classify and arrange in a logical order. Aristotle had come to Athens, a young stranger from the north. His father was court physician to the king of Macedonia, whose son was to conquer Greece, and whose grandson, Alexander the Great, was to conquer the world. In 343 BC, when Aristotle was about 40 and the foremost philosopher in Athens, he was called back to the capital of Macedonia to take charge of the education of the high-spirited young Alexander, who was then 13. After Alexander had conquered Persia and Egypt and was hoping to spend the Greek learning through the old countries of the East, he remembered his old teacher, who was then writing a history of animals. Alexander furnished money and 1,000 men to go through Greece and collect specimens. With the animals they brought back, Aristotle established the world's first zoo and also the science of zoology, though that was still jumbled together with all the other sciences under the name of philosophy. This long-standing disorder annoys Aristotle. Gathering together all the knowledge that he had been collected in the past, he classified and divided it into two parts, separating that which dealt with facts from that which dealt with ideas. And he then wrote what might probably be called the first encyclopedia. Aristotle was the last of the great Greek philosophers, and he himself was not a native of Athens, but a Macedonian. The golden age of Greece had long since passed. Rome was coming into power. By 146 BC, Rome had conquered the Mediterranean world. Then, just as the Romans had imported the old myths and gods of Greece, they also carried home the Greek philosophy. All educated Romans began to study Greek. The beliefs of the philosophers became the religion of such men as Cicero and Virgil. But the average people of Rome had also lost faith in the old gods, and they were not able to read Greek, nor to understand Plato, most of them, even if they had been able to read his books. But though they had not trained minds, they still had hearts and emotions, and they also wanted to know how to live in this world and to be happy. When life seemed unbearably wretched, they longed to believe that they might live again in a happier world. So the Romans kept searching for a new religion that even would give them hope. Some turned to the religion of the Jews, even though the laws seemed very severe. Others found comfort in the story of Osiris, who had risen to a new life and flocked to worship in the temple of the Holy Mother Isis there in Rome. Others gladly accepted Mirtha as their savior when she returning soldiers brought the Persian religion back from Parthia. Many merely lived from day to day with no religion at all. It was to correct this unhappy lack that Augustus had rebuilt the old temple, requested Virgil to write the Aeneid, and tried in every way to restore faith in the gods of the Roman forefathers. It could not be done. People's minds can never be squeezed back into ideas which they have outgrown, any more than growing a boy can get his foot back into a baby's shoe. Cicero, in his day, had also tried to fill the need of the Roman people. To him, it seemed a shame that they should be deprived of the Greek philosophy. Just because they could not understand the language, he decided to transfer some of the main Greek ideas into Latin. Just the year before Julius Caesar was killed, Cicero had written the book. It was dedicated to his friend Brutus, who, of all men, had tried stoically to live by what he believed was right. In simple language, Cicero had attempted to explain the difference between the Stoics and the Epicureans. These were two schools of thought that had grown out of the older philosophies. The Stoics, whose founder, Zeno, looked back to Socrates and Plato, believed that the world was ruled by a divine mind or God, and that a spark of that same mind was in each of us, and that part was immortal. Therefore, the only way for a man to live was to be guided by that spark of mind or conscience which was within, to try to understand and obey the divine law, and to know that whatever happened to him was the will of God. Epicureans looked back to Demetrius, who had said that there was no God, that the world including a man was all matter, nothing but space and atoms. Death ended everything. Therefore, since this life was all we had, why not make the best of it and be happy as we can, not caring too much about anything, doing nothing to excess, and living reasonably? That was the way to be truly happy, said Epicurus himself. But so many of his followers fell so far from that high standard and took happiness to be just the opposite, that an Epicurean came to mean one who loved the best food, the best wine, and all the so-called joys of luxurious living. That was why, perhaps, the poet Horace, who enjoyed the easy comforts of life, once remarked that he was a pig for the sty of Epicurus, though he may truly have believed in the original teaching. Most Romans were Stoics. Because the Romans had a genius for law and order, it was only natural that they should feel and respect the divine law governing the universe. The Greeks loved beauty and saw the beauty in the world, and they reflected what they saw in music, poetry, drama, sculpture, and beautiful philosophy and passed it on to the Romans. But the Romans, lacking that, was to pass on their great system of law and order to Europe. To each nation, like each person in the world, has had something special to contribute. No one person or race or nation has ever been or will ever be able to know all truth or express all the good to be found in the world.